January 1943. High above the Pacific Ocean. The sky is calm, almost empty. Only the low, steady vibration of a single engine cuts through the air. Inside the cockpit of a Japanese fighter, the world has narrowed to a few instruments: altitude, oil pressure, and one small gauge that refuses to be ignored. Fuel. Below, the ocean stretches endlessly. No landmarks, no ships, no coastline, just water and distance. The pilot's gloved hand rests lightly on the throttle. He does not look back. There is nothing behind him now. He has already passed the point of safety. Every mile forward steals a mile from the return. This fear is not sudden. It has been building since takeoff, since the moment the wheels left the runway. Not fear of enemy fire, but fear of mathematics, of fuel consumption, of time. Combat may come, or it may not. Either way, the fuel will decide everything. And when the gauge finally reaches its limit, fear will vanish, not because the danger ends, but because choice does. That moment in the sky did not begin here. It was shaped years earlier, by doctrine, design, and a war that stretched farther than engines were ever meant to fly. Before the Pacific War turned the sky into an ocean of distances, Japanese military aviation had been shaped by a very different reality. In the 1930s, Japan's air power was built for regional dominance, not global reach. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service and the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force developed separately, each with its own doctrines, rivalries, and aircraft programs. What united them was a shared assumption: wars would be decided quickly, through offensive spirit, not prolonged industrial struggle. Japanese air doctrine emphasized initiative, aggression, and reach. Pilots were trained to strike first, fly far, and return before the enemy could respond in force. Endurance mattered more than protection. Range mattered more than survivability. This thinking was reinforced during Japan's campaigns in China after 1937. Japanese aircraft often operated from nearby bases against poorly equipped opponents. Losses were acceptable. Missions were short. Fuel logistics were manageable. The sky rewarded speed and daring. Aircraft design followed this logic. Fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0 prioritized long range and maneuverability above all else. To achieve this, designers made deliberate sacrifices. Armor plating was minimal. Self-sealing fuel tanks were omitted. The aircraft was light, responsive, and deadly in skilled hands, but fragile. In pre-war calculations, this was not a flaw. It was a feature. Japanese planners believed that elite pilots, flying superior aircraft, would avoid damage through skill. They expected battles to be decisive and short. Fuel limitations were considered manageable, because the enemy was expected to collapse quickly. Training reflected this confidence. Japanese pilots underwent rigorous pre-war instruction, producing some of the most skilled aviators of the early war years. Dogfighting ability was prized. Discipline was absolute. Survival training, however, received far less attention. The assumption was simple: a pilot either completed the mission or did not return. There was little room in doctrine for prolonged survival over open ocean. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the system appeared to work. Long-range carrier aircraft crossed vast distances undetected. Fighters escorted bombers farther than many foreign analysts thought possible. The Zero dominated allied aircraft in the opening months. Success reinforced belief. Early victories across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies stretched Japan's air power outward. Each conquest added airfields and brought the enemy closer to defeat, at least in theory. But every mile gained increased the distance between Japan and its pilots. Fuel consumption rose. Maintenance cycles lengthened. Replacement aircraft took longer to arrive. And most critically, trained pilots became harder to replace than machines. By mid-1942, the war was no longer a series of short strikes. It had become a war of attrition across immense spaces of sea and sky. The Pacific did not forgive miscalculations. Japanese pilots now faced missions unlike anything they had trained for: long escorts over open water, narrow fuel margins, return flights that depended on perfect navigation and favorable winds. And as the war expanded, one truth became unavoidable: every mission pushed pilots farther from safety than doctrine had ever prepared them to go. That realization would fully emerge over a small island in the South Pacific where distance, fuel, and time began to turn fear into routine. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific War had reached a scale that Japanese planners had never intended to sustain. The capture of vast territories brought new responsibilities instead of closure. Long supply lines stretched from the home islands through Southeast Asia and into the South Pacific. Every new airfield demanded fuel, spare parts, trained mechanics, and pilots who could reach it and return. Nowhere was this strain more visible than in the Solomon Islands campaign. When Allied forces landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, Japan was forced into a prolonged battle for control of the skies over a remote, jungle-covered island more than 3,000 kilometers from Tokyo. Japanese aircraft operated primarily from bases at Rabaul, over 560 miles away from Guadalcanal. That distance defined everything for Japanese pilots. Missions to Guadalcanal were calculated with brutal precision. Fighters like the A6M0 could make the round trip, but only if conditions were ideal. Headwinds, combat maneuvers, or navigation errors could mean the difference between landing on a runway or ditching in the sea. There were no reserves, no safety margin. Every flight began with arithmetic. Pilots memorized fuel burn rates. They learned to fly at exact throttle settings for maximum efficiency. Combat was no longer about winning, it was about surviving long enough to turn back. The Americans understood this quickly. U.S. pilots learned that Japanese fighters often disengaged abruptly, not because they were losing, but because they had reached the invisible limit of their fuel. American commanders began planning operations that exploited time and distance, forcing Japanese aircraft to stay in the air longer than intended. While Japan struggled to sustain its elite pre-war pilots, the United States mobilized industrial power on an unprecedented scale. Aircraft production soared. Training pipelines expanded. Replacement pilots arrived continuously. Japan could not match this pace. Losses over Guadalcanal were devastating, not just in aircraft, but in experienced aviators. Each pilot lost represented years of training that could not be replaced quickly. New pilots received shorter instruction. Skill levels declined. Survival odds worsened. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. By late 1943, Allied submarine warfare began strangling Japan's oil supply. Refineries were bombed. Tankers were sunk. Aviation fuel became a strategic weapon. Training hours were cut. Operational flights were rationed. Pilots went to war with less practice than their predecessors. And with even tighter fuel limits, the psychological burden grew heavier with every mission. Veterans later described the same sensation. The outward flight filled with tension, the return flight dominated by silence. Engines were listened to like heartbeats. Gauges were watched more closely than the sky. Fear was not a moment of panic, it was a constant companion, measured in liters and minutes. By 1944, as battles expanded to the Marianas and the Philippines, the distances grew even greater. Missions from Formosa to Luzon, from Kyushu to Okinawa. Some flights were planned with barely enough fuel to reach the target, let alone return. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was a corridor with no margin for error. And somewhere between takeoff and landing, Japanese pilots began to realize that fear did not peak during combat, but during the long flight home. When the fuel gauge crept steadily toward empty, that realization shaped every angle of their experience: human, mechanical, tactical, and moral, each one narrowing their choices until only endurance remained. For Japanese pilots, fear was rarely expressed aloud. Military culture did not reward confession. Discipline demanded composure. Silence was strength. Yet fear existed in routines, habits, and small decisions made in the cockpit. Pilots learned to control their breathing to conserve oxygen. They avoided unnecessary radio transmissions. Some reduced speed below optimal combat settings just to preserve fuel. Others stared at the fuel gauge so often that it became a rhythmized to sky, eyes to needle. Again and again, veterans later recalled that the outward journey was always the hardest. The return offered at least the possibility of relief. But until the aircraft turned home, fear remained unresolved. There was no heroism in distance, only endurance. The aircraft itself offered little comfort. Japanese fighters were designed for reach, not survival. The Zero's lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks made even minor damage catastrophic. A single bullet could ignite fuel. A small leak could doom the return flight. Fuel gauges were not always reliable. Wind conditions were unpredictable. Engines aged quickly under tropical conditions. Technology did not forgive miscalculation. Japanese missions required rigid fuel discipline. Escorts were planned down to the minute. Combat time over target was limited. If bombers were delayed, fighters often had to abandon them. American pilots noticed this pattern. They learned to extend engagements, forcing Japanese aircraft to break off early. Time became a weapon. Distance replaced firepower. Every tactic now revolved around a single question: how long could a pilot stay airborne before fuel decided the outcome? And as tactics evolved, leadership faced impossible choices that shaped the final angle still to come. Japanese air commanders understood the danger their pilots faced. Reports from Guadalcanal, Rabaul, and the Philippines made the reality clear. Missions were being flown at the edge of possibility. Yet leadership remained trapped by doctrine and circumstance. Operational orders emphasized persistence. Air superiority was demanded even when resources could not sustain it. Commanders had few alternatives. Retreat meant conceding territory. Shorter missions meant abandoning isolated garrisons. Fuel shortages were not solved by courage. As losses mounted, orders grew harsher. Missions were flown regardless of weather, fatigue, or diminishing margins. Command decisions increasingly transferred risk downward onto the pilot alone, in the cockpit. Far from command rooms and maps. American aviators and intelligence officers studied Japanese flight patterns carefully. They noted when enemy fighters disengaged. They calculated likely fuel ranges. They learned that Japanese pilots often flew with just enough fuel to return under ideal conditions. This knowledge shaped American tactics. Fighter sweeps were timed to catch Japanese aircraft late in their mission cycle. Bombing raids targeted airfields and fuel depots. Attrition was no longer accidental, it was designed. The sky became a trap measured in minutes. For Japanese pilots, duty did not erase fear, it framed it. Many understood that their chances of survival were shrinking. Letters home grew shorter. Some stopped writing altogether. Acceptance began to replace hope, not through ideology alone, but through experience. When fuel ran low, fear did not escalate. It ended. There were no decisions left to make. This was the moment every mission approached, a moment that would define the war's most harrowing flights. When engines faltered and distance could no longer be negotiated, that moment would arrive again and again. During the war's most decisive air battles. By late 1943, the moment Japanese pilots feared most was no longer theoretical. It was happening, repeatedly, across the Pacific. One of the clearest examples unfolded during the air war over Guadalcanal and Rabaul. Japanese strike formations often launched before dawn. Bombers climbed slowly, heavy with fuel and ordnance. Fighters formed escort patterns designed to conserve every possible leader. Once airborne, there was no flexibility. The mission clock had already started. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, the distance was unforgiving, over for hours of flight time round trip under perfect conditions. Any deviation meant loss. American radar installations and forward air patrols extended engagements deliberately. Japanese pilots found themselves circling, climbing, diving, burning fuel they could not replace. Combat reports from U.S. Navy and Marine pilots described Japanese fighters breaking contact abruptly, even when they held positional advantage. This was not retreat. It was arithmetic. As the war moved north into the Marianas Campaign in 1944, the problem intensified. Japanese aircraft launched from bases in the Philippines and Formosa to intercept American carrier task forces. These missions often pushed fighters beyond safe return range. Pilots knew this before takeoff. They memorized headings. They counted minutes. They calculated wind drift by instinct. Some reduced throttle to dangerous levels just to stretch distance. Still, fuel ran out. American after-action reports increasingly recorded Japanese aircraft ditching at sea. Without combat damage, rescue was rare. The Pacific was vast. The chances of survival were minimal. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, U.S. pilots witnessed Japanese aircraft falling from the sky. Engines silent, not from gunfire, but exhaustion. Fuel, not firepower, ended the engagement. For Japanese pilots, this was the turning point. Fear was no longer tied to enemy aircraft. It was tied to the fuel gauge, to the sound of the engine changing pitch, to the growing certainty that the return journey might not exist. And once that certainty took hold, everything changed. Because when fuel reached its final measure, the pilot faced a moment more decisive than combat, a moment when the outcome could no longer be influenced by skill, discipline, or courage. That moment would define the final phase of Japanese air warfare. The final minutes of a Japanese pilot's flight were often the quietest. There were no enemy aircraft in sight, no radio chatter, no evasive maneuvers left to perform. Only the engine and the knowledge that it was nearing its limit. As fuel thinned, engines began to behave differently. Power fluctuated. Vibrations changed. Pilots listened carefully, adjusting mixture controls, reducing throttle, coaxing the last possible minutes from the machine. Some climbed slightly, trading altitude for glide distance. Others descended toward the sea, hoping to spot land that might not be there. When the engine finally sputtered, fear did not surge. It stopped. Veterans later described this moment with startling consistency. Once the engine failed, the outcome was no longer uncertain. The struggle ended. What remained was acceptance. Some pilots aimed for the nearest visible island, even if it was enemy-held. Others ditched near shipping lanes, hoping for capture instead of death. Many disappeared without witnesses, swallowed by the Pacific. In late 1944 and early 1945, as fuel supplies collapsed further, Japanese command increasingly planned missions that assumed non-return. Interception flights were launched with barely enough fuel to reach the enemy. Return was optional. Survival became secondary to impact. This transition did not occur suddenly. It grew from countless flights where fuel had already decided the outcome. By the time organized kamikaze operations emerged during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the psychological shift had already taken place. For many pilots, the difference between return and non-return missions was no longer vast, it was a matter of intent. Not experience. Fuel had already removed choice. The climax of this reality was not a single battle or date. It was repeated, quietly, in the sky whenever a pilot realized that fear had lost its purpose because nothing remained to be preserved. And when the engine went silent, the war's most decisive enemy revealed itself, not the opposing aircraft, but distance itself. That silence reshaped the aftermath of Japanese air power and altered the course of the Pacific War permanently. By 1945, the skies over the Pacific had changed completely. Japanese air power, once feared for its reach and precision, was now defined by absence. Aircraft were fewer. Experienced pilots were rare. Fuel shortages dictated when and whether missions could even be attempted. The numbers told a stark story. During the Guadalcanal campaign alone, Japan lost hundreds of aircraft and, more critically, a generation of highly trained aviators. These losses could not be replaced. Training programs were shortened. Flight hours were reduced to conserve fuel. New pilots entered combat with a fraction of the experience their predecessors had possessed. American forces, by contrast, grew stronger with each month. U.S. aircraft production reached levels Japan could not approach. Pilots rotated out after combat tours. Training remained extensive. Fuel was abundant. Range became an advantage rather than a risk. Strategically, Japanese air operations shifted from offensive dominance to reactive desperation. Interception missions were flown only when absolutely necessary. Escorts were reduced or eliminated. Bombers flew with minimal fighter protection. Each mission was evaluated not by likelihood of success, but by fuel availability. This reality altered behavior at every level. Pilots became more cautious not in combat, but in navigation. Commanders adjusted routes to shorten distances, even if it meant flying predictable paths. Airfields closer to the front became prime targets for Allied bombing, further shrinking operational options. Psychologically, the change was profound. Survivors described a growing detachment. The future narrowed. Fear was no longer tied to survival, but to uncertainty. When fuel wasn't sufficient, the mission was already decided. In official reports, language grew colder. Aircraft were expended. Pilots were lost. Distance became an accepted casualty. The Pacific War's air battles were no longer contests of maneuver or marksmanship. They were contests of logistics, and Japan was losing. And as this imbalance deepened, Japanese leadership drew conclusions that would reshape the final phase of the war's aerial fighting. Those conclusions would carry consequences far beyond the cockpit. As Japan's fuel reserves dwindled further, air strategy crossed a line from calculation into inevitability. By late 1944, aviation gasoline had become one of the rarest commodities in the empire. Allied submarine campaigns had devastated tanker traffic. Refineries struggled under bombing. Training flights were canceled or reduced to brief hops around airfields. Many pilots first encountered full combat conditions on operational missions. The shortage reshaped doctrine. Operations were no longer designed around return. They were designed around impact. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese air units launched with the understanding that recovery was unlikely. While organized kamikaze attacks represented a formal expression of this reality, the underlying conditions already existed. Fuel planning assumed one-way trajectories long before official policy acknowledged it. The sky reflected this shift. American pilots reported Japanese aircraft flying straight and level, conserving fuel until the final moment. Interceptions became shorter, evasion less common. The emphasis moved from survival to contact. Fuel, once a limitation, became a strategic weapon wielded by the side that could deny it. By the final months of the war, Japanese airfields were quiet not from lack of will, but from lack of gasoline. Aircraft sat grounded. Pilots waited. Missions were rationed like lives. The Pacific's vast distances, once conquered through bold engineering and daring flight, now imposed an unbreakable barrier. The aftermath was not just material. It was conceptual. Air warfare had proven that courage could not overcome logistics. Skill could not replace fuel. Distance could defeat ideology. When the war ended, analysts across the world took note. Aircraft design changed. Training emphasized survivability. Fuel planning became central to doctrine. The lessons were written not in manuals, but in the ocean where countless aircraft vanished without combat, their final enemy unseen. And yet, beyond the statistics and strategies. One truth remained human. For the pilots who flew those missions, fear was real but temporary. Because when fuel ran low, fear had nothing left to protect. That understanding shapes how this story finally comes to rest. War is often remembered through battles, victories, and defeat. But in the sky over the Pacific, it was remembered in measurements, miles, minutes, liters. For Japanese pilots, fear did not always arrive with enemy aircraft or tracer fire. It arrived quietly, during long flights over open water, when the horizon offered no certainty and the fuel gauge refused to lie. Their terror was not weakness. It was awareness. They understood, more clearly than most, that modern war was no longer decided solely by courage or skill. It was decided by supply lines, production capacity, and endurance factors far removed from the cockpit. When fuel ran low, fear ended not because danger vanished, but because choice did. That moment reveals something enduring about warfare. Technology expands reach, but distance still demands a price. Ideology promises purpose, but logistics determine survival. The Pacific were taught the world that the sky is not infinite and neither is human endurance. Today, those silent aircraft rest beneath the ocean, unmarked by graves or monuments. Yet their legacy remains, shaping how air forces plan, how pilots train, and how wars are measured. Not by how far aircraft can fly, but by how much they can afford to lose. If this story changed the way you see aerial warfare, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. And if you value historically grounded, cinematic documentaries like this, consider liking the video. It helps ensure that stories shaped by reality, not myth, continue to be told.